Hello there, and welcome back to our 10-part extended series on how to improve our democracy. My name is Josh Landers. I'm a student here at San Jose State in the Communication Studies Department, and with the supervision of Scott Lasco, professor and coach of the Forensics and Speech and Debate team, I was able to compile this 10-part series on how to improve our democracy. Let's get into it. So, improving our democracy. Getting rid of the two-party system. This video here is going to be about getting rid of the two-party system because it doesn't work. But before we could get into that, I would like first to explain a little bit about what is a democracy. Before we could improve a democracy, first, me and our audience, we have to understand, or my audience and I, we have to understand what is a democracy. So let's get into it. What is democracy? So democracy comes from the Greek word demos, meaning people. In democracies, it is the people who hold sovereign power over legislator and government. Although nuances apply to the world's various democracies, certain principles and practices distinguish democratic government from other forms of government. Democracy is government in which power and civic responsibility are exercised by all citizens, directly or through their freely elected representatives. So before we go on, I want to pause there for a sec just so I could distinguish. So in the original forms of democracy, when we're talking about its origins, down in Greece a long time ago, that was more of a direct democracy, right? One man, one vote is so it was called. So again, direct democracy. Everyone represented their own selves in the democratic process. One vote, majority rule type of situation. Whereas here in America, the democracy that this project is focused on improving, we actually have a representative democracy. What's a representative democracy, you ask? A representative democracy is where we, the people, use our democratic process and our individual votes to elect representatives such as Congress or the House of Representatives and the Senate on the grand scale, or maybe locally we're talking about city council or state legislator and things like that. We use our civic power, our democratic power, to vote for people who can represent us in the decision-making process. So the biggest decisions we make are who's going to represent us more than having every single person vote for every single issue. Democracy is a government, we went over that. Democracy is a set of principles and practices that protect human freedom. It is the institutionalization of freedom. Democracy rests upon the principles of majority rule, coupled with the individual and minority rights. All democracies, while respecting the will of the majority, zealously protect the fundamental rights of individuals and minority groups. This is important because just because it's a democracy doesn't mean that if the majority of people say, for example, they vote no Jews allowed, or all Jews have to leave, or, let's get rid of all the Jews, that is not end all be all majority rule, right? There are things in place to protect minorities. That's one of the core principles of democracy. Democracy guards against all powerful central governments and decentralized government to regional and local levels, understanding that local government must be as accessible and responsive to the people as possible. Democracies understand that one of their prime functions is to protect such basic human rights as freedom of speech and religion, the right to equal protection under the law, and the opportunity to organize and participate in the political, economic, and cultural life of society. Wow. So I hope we all have a solid understanding of what it is to be a democracy, what it means to be a democracy. Now that we understand that, let's get an understanding of what is a two-party system. So, a two-party system. Two-party systems create a political structure for a country where the general population gets to choose between two specific platforms in each election. That means there will always be a majority and a minority party in this system. There are several governments around the world which utilize a system like this, but it is the United States who has who has had the most success with the dual party approach. Um, yes, we've had success. We're one of the most powerful nations um, in the world, right? In the history of the world. But at the same time, if you were really to ask any given American if those parties represent them, if you were to ask me, who's a leftist, does the Democratic Party represent you? I would say no. And if you were to ask um, my brother, who's a conservative, if the Republican Party represents him, he would tell you no as well. So it has success, but I don't know if it has the level of success that we're looking for. The modern American political parties are the Republicans and the Democrats. For context, the current political landscape has become increasingly polarizing and increasingly toxic, as I was just mentioning. I will explain why the two-party system is bad for our democracy, mainly because of the polarization it causes. I will also explain some possible replacement systems and why it would improve our democracy. Right? So yeah, I was getting at that a little bit. Just like the polarization that it causes, it forces someone like me and someone like my brother, who are part of the same nation, same city, right? Same democracy, same political entity, to feel like sometimes like we're on different teams or like my interests are different than his interests. And while it is a democracy, so individuals have the right to express their own personal interests, the two-party system creates an environment or a culture where we look at our fellow Americans. Um, we forget that they're our fellow Americans. We feel like they're playing for the other team because they want it to go in a different direction than we do. I had a video here to explain today based on time. I am going to have to skip this, but he's explaining a little bit about the polarization that is happening politically and how people are being pulled further and further away from the center and how it's becoming harmful to the political fabric of our nation. So here are some negative effects of the two-party system. First, it excludes viable candidates from having a legitimate chance at being elected. If you want to run for office successfully in the United States, then you are forced to join one of these two political parties that are prominent in the system of government, right? If I'm someone, a young student just graduated, I have a new political vision for the future of America, one that doesn't necessarily align with what's been happening, say, the past 50 years. I would have no choice but to choose the lesser of two evils and to align myself with that party. It doesn't leave room for new visionaries. Take Bernie Sanders, for example. Bernie Sanders was kind of misaligned with the Democratic Party, but when he ran for president, he was forced to run as a Democrat because that is where the power is. So, secondly, when someone declares their candidacy for office, their affiliation either creates an assumption that their choices will be similar to the platform and they indicate their support. So, yeah, essentially, as soon as Bernie signed up to be a Democrat, it led a lot of people to believe that his policies would be, and this is just an example, but it led people to believe his policies were aligned with that party, and it turned a lot of people off. So, as we continue here, the two-party system create autonomous. The two-party system creates autonomous between fellow countrymen. Um, in order for democracy to work, competing parties must accept that they can lose elections, but that is okay. But when partisans see their political opposition not just as opposition, but as a genuine threat to the well-being of their nation, support for democratic norms fade. Lastly, it encourages a lack of voter knowledge. Two-party systems and subsequent party loyalty leads voters to rely on their party affiliation rather than researching the candidates themselves. And that's a very important point because in our earlier videos, we discussed how education is so essential to a democracy. What happens when the education dwindles and the two-party system rises is that instead of doing research on specific issues and voting on specific issues, we rely on our party affiliation for our vote. We just check every red box or every blue box, if that makes sense, because maybe we don't have the education necessary for civic engagement, and maybe the two-party system is just, we don't know any other way. So I would like to offer some other ways, some alternatives. So alternatives to the two-party system. Multi-party systems like parliament are implemented around the world. There's a laundry list of countries from Argentina to Ukraine that are examples of nations that have used multi-party systems effectively in their democracy. One-party systems can exist as well, but I do not advocate for homogenous systems of government. That's usually like a smaller government, more control, centralized government, and things like that. But a multi-party system is something that I am advocating for because I'm someone that feels politically disenfranchised as a third-party voter. How would this improve our democracy? Dissatisfaction with two-party politics is at an all-time high, with 62% of Americans saying Democrats and Republicans are doing a poor job of representing their constituents and that a third party is needed. This transition would please many Americans and re-engage them into the democratic process, but it seems increasingly unlikely. It seems impossible. The notion of a third-party candidate being successful seems impossible because we're so ingrained in this two-party system, and that's why it's so harmful. Now more than ever, it is important that the country should come first before party. Change is imperative because a united country can do more than a divided one. Yeah, so back to mainly in conclusion, the overall point is that the two-party system creates a division in our country that is increasingly getting out of hand. And I think it would be better if we could see our fellow Americans as such, as fellow Americans, not as someone playing for the other political team. All right, so in conclusion, we have a quiz question here for you. Which country does not use a multi-party system as opposed to a two-party system? Well, the answer is C, the United States. The United States does not use a multi-party system, and it leaves people like me disenfranchised. I think it would improve our democracy if we expanded to a multi-party system and left the two-party system behind. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next time.